What if we knew more about shellfish reproduction? So much of our food systems are based on terrestrial organisms, both plant and animal, and we're really just starting to scratch the surface at understanding how marine and freshwater organisms thrive and how to culture them. And especially with shellfish, which we often like to eat. And what I mean by shellfish are crabs and lobsters, shrimp, and then you have the bivalves, which include mussels and oysters and clams and scallops, which are my personal favorite. And most of what we'll talk about in these 15 minutes. And they are my favorite for several reasons. One of which is that I think they are absolutely beautiful. They're this soft body between two ridged shells, and they live in the ocean. You won't ever find them in a freshwater system. And these beautiful shells, which come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, have been symbols of fertility in human cultures. Sometimes they've been tiny bowls to fill with food. They've been the symbol of a sunset, death, and are often found on coats of arms in European traditions. And there are hundreds of species today, and there were hundreds more millions and millions of years ago. So they've been around quite a while. And one of the most fascinating aspects of them, I think, is that they have tens to hundreds of eyes that allow them to actually see. They can see shadows, shapes. There are people that are studying this right now to figure out how much they can see and how responsive they are, and ultimately why they need so many eyes. They're not in a place that we normally think of. They're along the edge of their body. It's called the mantle. And usually we think of eyes as being two, right, and paired on our head, but these are all along their periphery. And some recent research has actually come out that show that they actually reach with their longer tentacles towards objects they see as they pass. So really, really fascinating with all of these little eyes. They're also a lot of them really good swimmers. They have this big swimming muscle, which is helping propel the scallop you can see on the left side of the screen. But we generally like to eat them, and you can see that on the right side of the screen. They're pan-seared, which admittedly are very, very good. And that's the part we usually eat, at least in America. In other cultures, they eat the whole thing. And sometimes they also eat it with the gonad. And that's the last point I want to come to, which is that they have very, very large gonads during the spawning season. And it depends on the species, of course, but the species I'm most familiar with and that you can find in Maine is the Atlantic sea scallop, sometimes called the ocean scallop, or the giant sea scallop. Either way, they have gonads that can become about a third of their body weight during the spawning season. And the females usually have a bright orange color. And you'll get to see a picture of some of the eggs that are orange in a minute. And the males tend to have white gonads that are filled with sperm. This might seem like obvious color choices, but not every species of bivalve has these color differentiations. And before we talk a little bit more about the reproduction, why do we care about the reproduction of a sea creature? Well, we like to eat these creatures, right? Although some of us like to admire them for their beauty and want to just see them grow and thrive. But in order to have more of them around, you have to be able to let them reproduce, and you have to help them reproduce by making sure the environment is in the right condition. And so there is a lot at stake, frankly, when we think about whether or not we let shellfish reproduce or can help them reproduce. But one thing that's important to understand about reproduction and studying it, as I have for my PhD, is that one does not simply study reproduction. There are many parts. Today, I'm going to divide it into three major parts. Because when we think of reproduction, I think of everything from when the adults start to develop their gonads, and then they spawn those eggs and sperm into the water column. And then those eggs and sperm meet, and then they develop into larvae, the baby scallops, baby bivalves, basically. A lot of organisms in the ocean, their baby form is the larval form, which can look very, very different from what the adults end up looking like. And then there's the behavior, survival, mortality rates, and transportation of those larvae to wherever they may land and survive and turn into juveniles and then adults. So it is not a simple process, and there are many parts to it, and it makes it really difficult to study. So the first stage we'll talk about is spawning. And spawning can be a lot of fun to actually see when it happens, but it can also be very, very tedious because often we have to wait a really long time for them to, and by them I mean adult sea scallops, to spawn when they are ready to spawn. There's some species out there that are a lot easier to work with, like a lot of oyster species. You can strip spawn, and what that means is that you take out the gonads from one of the animals, effectively killing them, and then putting that gonad in the water column, and all those gametes, usually sperm, release, and then others start spawning in the water because they're stimulated by the release of those sperm into the water column. But with sea scallops in Maine, they tend to spawn in the late summer. This isn't always strictly true, it can vary a bit, and into the fall. And depending where they're found along the coast and whether or not they're found offshore or in Canada, they have quite a range. They might spawn at slightly different times, and there might be different kinds of environmental cues like tidal changes or food in the water column, all sorts of things. But when they do finally spawn, we can see and look under the microscope at sort of the composition of the gametes and everything else that's released with them. And in this picture, you can see there's a bunch of scallops, and that's my finger in a blue glove as I'm using a syringe to suck up all the eggs. They're about 60 microns, which is probably about the width of a human hair, each one. And so they look kind of like specks of red dust. Maybe you might imagine the movie Dune or the book Dune when you think of the fine red dust. And so we can collect these and do experiments where we see how many sperm does it take to fertilize an egg, and if there are a lot of adults, do you have a lot of eggs? Do you get a lot of fertilization? And there are a lot of questions we can ask about how the eggs and sperm get fertilized and how they develop and how they engage with the environment, because they're released into the water column. And so they are not all wrapped up in each other in a little vial somewhere. They're out in the ocean, hopefully meeting very soon so that they can turn into larvae and then juveniles and adults again. And this piece of art I have up is something I made during my PhD. You can see they're actual scallop shells, but you can see these orange waves and these white waves. And they're meant to be symbolic of the eggs and the sperm that are being released into the water column. And in the middle, you can see that they're blending together, these eggs and sperm. And there's this orange color, which you don't necessarily see, but it's sort of my visualization of it, where they turn into larvae. And you can see at the very top here, there's all these different stages of egg development as it divides and goes through these different developmental stages, eventually to spat, which is a newly settled juvenile, and then turn into this juvenile sized shell that I put up here. And so what goes on in this process, I've made an artistic representation, but a lot of this is still somewhat mysterious to us. And if we could know exactly when fertilization occurs or how the chemistry of the environment impact the release of these sperms and egg, and we can find out how the pH changes it, other nutrients in the water, and do other animals eat these while they get released? That's another good question. And how do those currents play a role, right? In the ocean, it moves. So how quickly do they get dispersed? Is it a problem? Is the place where we want to put our scallops going to matter because of how strong the currents are? These are all questions that some researchers are trying to answer. And if we have the answers to these questions, we can learn how to better grow and keep alive these animals as they continue on their life cycle. But that's not where the mystery ends. The mysteries keep continuing with larval development, survival, and transportation, because once those little specks become larvae instead of just sperm and egg meeting, they have a long way to travel, and they have a whole bunch of different stages to survive through. And all the while, they're being transported on these oceanic currents. And these are a couple of pictures of bivalve larvae. Bivalves, again, are the shellfish that have two shells that show you some of the different stages. There are a lot of different stages, but the one on the right shows you what's usually called like a D stage, and they look kind of like the letter D. And on the left, you can see that a stage near the D stage has what's called veliger out to swim. Veligers are sort of like little parachutes with all these little cilia on the end to help them swim and to feel things in the water. And so they swim with their little D pancakes and parachutes through the water column, sometimes pulling in their parachutes so they can drop like a stone. But all the while, they're all very, very tiny. You know, we're talking about 100 microns to maybe 300 at most. And so maybe, you know, a couple of human hairs in terms of width. Again, very, very tiny, and they can travel so far. And one of the things we wonder about a lot is, where do these guys go? Where are they going? And how connected are these populations? If we harvest all the adults in one place in Maine, does that fundamentally knock out another population? Because on the currents, that's where all their new babies and then adults come from. So the oceanography is really, really important for this. And it's something that if we knew more about, we would really understand how our harvesting or how our pollution or any kind of activities that impact one shellfish population might impact all the others for a simple species. So one does not simply study population connectivity. That's what I'm talking about here. And as an example, I'm going to show you a very complicated diagram that I created for a project on mussel larvae in Maine from 2014. It's a concept diagram. It's very messy, which is kind of the point. But here you have different colors. Each of these circles represents a population. And each color is a different location. And they're sort of arranged geographically. There's some white lines indicating where there might be some breaks because of some physical features and some islands. And the main point here is that this is a very complicated system that's based on data that's collected. This is a concept, but this is based on essentially data we collected that show that there are certain populations that contribute a lot of larvae. You see a lot of orange and you see a lot of dark blue. There's a lot of larvae going to other places from there. And then you have places like Raccoon Cove, which is in green, that really doesn't share that much of its larvae. And then you have places like Pleasant Bay, where you see these pink lines going everywhere. And it seems to be crossing that threshold, the Petite Manan threshold, all the way to Goldsboro Bay. So something's going on there where those larvae are getting across. And so you have all these different dynamics from the transportation of water currents affecting how these populations are connected to each other. So it's a very complicated system. And if we knew more about all these aspects of reproduction, we could learn so much about how the environment is important to their ability to persist. And I like to think about what we could learn about animals that we know even little about. I'm mostly talking about scallops, which you like to eat, but what about all those other organisms that have the same connectivity? And how would this affect the way we protect them or engage with them or grow them or eat them? Their reproduction is going to tell us a lot about how strong and resilient their populations are and what they need to successfully survive. So some final questions for you to think about before continuing on to the next section. What if you could learn anything about how sea creatures reproduce? What would you want to know? Would you want to grow them and take care of them? Where would you grow them and for what purpose?